I hope. Here we go. It's also live on YouTube and streaming there. So thank you everybody for tuning in. I'm going to actually dedicate this shiur to the memory of my father. His 30th yortzeit is tomorrow night. Shlomo ben Zora Halevi. So he was a decorated war hero in World War II, spent 3.5 years in the Philippines. Among others, was a reconnaissance photographer for the Army Air Force. At that time, they were combined. And in general, he was a great father. So tonight we're going to talk about, as I titled it, A Tale of Two Converts. And we may perhaps burst some bubbles and some kind of preconceived notions that people have had for a long time as we discuss this Parsha of Yitro. So let's begin by saying that Yitro is one of only 6 people whose names are chosen to grace a Sedra. It's a big honor because this is something eternal. So for all of time, Yitro is going to have his name connected. And it's to a very special Parsha, of course, because it's the Aseret HaDibrot. So people who may not even normally come to shul, they're going to tune in, of course, to hear the 10 Commandments. So it's quite an honor bestowed upon Yitro. Does he deserve it? We're going to talk about that. Early in his career, just to delve a little bit into who Yitro was, he was always a very prominent person. He was actually one of the 3 primary advisors to the Pharaoh, to Paro, along with Bilam and Eov, or Job, if you want his English name. And one of the things they did, one of the defining moments was when Paro asked his advisors, what do we do about the Jewish question? You know, Paro was extremely gifted as a strategist and in general, a very, very clever person. But he sought advice from these counselors. Bilam urged Paro to either enslave the population, the Jewish population, or to get rid of them. And he may have been the one who came up with this idea of killing the boys, because, as you know, in some cultures, as exists in Islam today, the males can marry anyone to produce children. So they would leave the women, leave the daughters, the baby girls, but not the boys. That was Bilam. His fate, ultimately, because of this and other things, he was ultimately killed, as you know, in the war against Midian. Eov, or Job, he kept silent. He said nothing. And he would undergo, if you've read the book of Eov, severe trials and traumas throughout his life, perhaps unlike anyone else. Yitro, for his part, ran away. That's what he did. And this act of fleeing Paro, in essence, distancing himself from the Egyptian Holocaust, served Yitro quite well. He became a respected Kohen, or priest, in Midian. He acquired great wealth and prestige. He was a VIP. And of course, he gained the most illustrious son-in-law, Moshe Rabbeinu. His reward, Mida Keneged Mida, measure for measure, was spectacular. And it seems like running away was clearly a good move on his part. And we should give him credit for that. He, did perhaps what he felt was the least of the evils. But does he deserve to actually have a Sedra named for him, or it's over and done? But the question is it really something that's coming to him? Well, the Parsha begins, Vayishma Yitro, and Yitro, Kohen Midian, Yitro heard Kol Asher Asa Elokim LeMoshe, everything that God had done both for Moshe and for the Jewish people. What did he hear? So Rashi comments and says he heard 2 things. He heard about Kriyat Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea, and he heard about the war with Amalek. Now, there are other commentators who want to say, well, perhaps in addition to that, there was a third thing that he heard. He heard about the giving of the Torah. And then he came. But Rashi doesn't mention that. It's interesting. It's obviously a cataclysmic event that the whole world was enthralled by, we say. The Matan Torah was a world-shaking event. This God himself proclaiming and bringing down the law to the earth. Rashi excludes that. Very puzzling why he wouldn't mention that. And if Yitro only heard about the splitting of the sea and about the war with Amalek, why is this hearing recorded here in Parshat Yitro? It should have been in last week's Sedra of Bishalach. That's where these two events are specifically mentioned. Why here? I would also ask, why does he appear necessarily in this Parsha of the Ten Commandments and the Ma'amad Har Sinai? And our overall question, of course, is he really the ger, the convert par excellence, the standard, we would call it the Cadillac standard of excellence for sincere conversion? And that's what we're going to try to examine. Now, you know, as we've talked about many times before, we look for clues. Again, the Torah is not written for dummies. It's written for people who really want to study and delve into it and open their eyes and ears and try to figure out what's really going on. And part of that, part of our exercise in being a detective in the Torah is looking at the text and trying to see even beyond the meaning, but trying to look for clues to solve these puzzles. And all you have to do is really listen to yourself read to notice something that stands out, that just basically hits you right over the head if you are listening. So listen. Vayishma Yitro Kohen Midyan Chotein Moshe. The Yitro, the priest of Midyan, the father-in-law of Moshe, heard. That's the first pasuk. Later on, next pasuk, Vayikach Yitro Chotein Moshe. At Tzipora, so Yitro, the father-in-law of Moshe, takes Tzipora, who is his daughter, and gives her in marriage to Moshe, and they have two children. Then pasuk Hey, Vayavo Yitro Chotein Moshe Vanav Yishtrol Moshe. Then Yitro, the father-in-law of Moshe, and his children, his daughter, they come to Moshe into the Midbar, into the desert. And then Vayomer El Moshe, then Yitro says, Ani chotencha Yitro ba'alecha. I, Yitro, your father-in-law, have come before you. And then what does Moshe do? Vayetze Moshe likrat chotno. Moshe goes to greet his father-in-law. Are you getting a picture here? Is something, any bells ringing? Vayisaper Moshe lechotno, and then Moshe told his father-in-law, his father-in-law, his father-in-law, his father-in-law, his father-in-law, his father-in-law. You never see Vayomer Moshe liyitro. And he keeps identifying himself, and the Torah keeps telling us over and over and over again. Guess what? Yitro was Moshe's father-in-law. Really? Did you have to tell me 13 times? And if you count in the Sedra, you'll see that's how many times. Gee, I might have gotten it after the first 10 times. Why do you keep telling me that Yitro was Moshe's father-in-law? I get it. He married Yitro's daughter. That would make him the father-in-law. Well, obviously, the Torah, it seems to me, is telling us right from the get-go that whatever name and fame Yitro would enjoy, at least as far as we're concerned, maybe we're not the people of Midyan, but at least as far as the Jewish people are concerned, comes about solely because of his connection to this illustrious son-in-law. If not for Moshe, Yitro would never have been immortalized. He would have been a forgotten footnote of history. Instead, his name lives on because of this connection to one of the greatest, if not the greatest Jews who ever lived. And that's why the Torah constantly, continually, almost obsessively tells us over and over that Yitro is Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law. Well, we know about this early career of Yitro, but what happened to Yitro? Did he cast his lot ultimately with the Jewish people? This is a subject of great debate among the rabbis. And it essentially centers around a small section later on in the Torah, Parshat Bahalotcha. This is in Bamidbar, the 10th chapter. And there, as Moshe comes together again, guess who with who? Vayomer Moshe Lechovev. He has another name, Yitro, by the way. Chotein Moshe. There it is again. We have to say that right away. And Moshe tries to convince Yitro to accompany the Jewish people and to be part of Am Yisrael. And Yitro is resistant. And in just a few words, it's so fascinating. He says what, and anyone who's come and to live in Israel and who's been involved in Aliyah has heard this before. So he says to Yitro, and I'll come back to this later, and he says, excuse me, he says, come with us, L'cha itanu ve'tavnu lach, come with us, it'll be good for you. And he tries to convince him. The Torah doesn't go into great detail, but Yitro responds, Vayomer elav lo elech, I shall not go. Ki im el artzi, ve'el moladati elech. In just these 7 words, he sums up why he's not going. And we've heard this before. First of all, he says, Ki im el artzi, it is to my land I shall go. And here, by the way, you might take this literally, his land meaning his real estate. He was a wealthy man, wealthy in Midian. Or it might just mean loyalty to the old country, loyalty to where I come from. And then, of course, he mixes in moladati, and I have to be with my family. They're living in Midian. How can I leave? This is the classic response to those who never come in Aliyah. I stay where my parnasa is, my money, my investments. I am comfortable in my land. I know the slang. I have street smarts here, and I'm loyal to this country. And of course, how can I leave my family? So we don't really know for sure. I'll suggest what I think. I do think that whether or not Yitro ever joins up with the Jewish people, or he goes back to Midian and lives the rest of his life there. And Moshe continues with his family, but not with that father-in-law that we've heard so much about. I want to try to explore the deeper reason behind Yitro's decision to convert to Judaism, which pretty much everybody agrees that he did, whatever conversion meant then. So Yitro is coming from an interesting place. And basically, you can sum up his motivation there in the Pasuk. This is in our Sedra. It's the 18th. It's the 18th parak and the 11th Pasuk, where Yitro comes to Moshe and he says, let me find it. Ata yadati ki gadol Hashem mikol ha'elokim. Says Yitro, I now have learned that Hashem, God, is the greatest of all gods. And Rashi comments very succinctly, Milamed shahaya makir b'kol avodah zarah shabaolam. This teaches us that Yitro was an expert and knew about and had experience with every type of religion or idolatry in the world. Shelo hiniach avodah zarah shelo avda. There wasn't a single type of religion or deity that Yitro had not sampled from Astarte to Zeus, from A to Z. And he had even, by the way, taught this approach to Moshe's son Gershom. According to the Midrash, when Moshe came to Midian and asked to marry Tzipporah, Yitro said, on one condition, and that condition is, I want that your first child, my grandson, I want him to experience what I experienced. I want him to sample all the different religions. And indeed, in a very mysterious comment, and the Talmud talks about this, and we normally don't air our dirty laundry in public, but we learn that while we're not sure exactly what happened to Gershom, but his son, meaning Moshe's grandson, or Yitro's great-grandson, became an idolater. He became a priest to idol worship. And in a very fascinating, and I know some of you, if I don't see everybody who's on, if Fred Ehrman is on, I know he has a whole discussion about this, an excellent discussion. And in Shoftim, in the book of Judges, in the 18th chapter, in the 30th pasuk, they identify this individual. He's called until then the Levi. Now, remember, of course, Moshe is from the tribe of Levi, as are his descendants, and he serves as a priest or as a idolatrous administrator in a temple there. And when giving his name, Yonatan, which of course is a fine name and associated, of course, with one of the heroes of the Jewish people, but his name also Yonatan, ben Gershom, ben Menashe. But something strange happens here if you look at it, even in not just in a scroll, but in any book, the nun floats above the line, so that while it's there, it's not there. If you take away the nun instead of the word Menashe, what do you get? You get Moshe. And here, lo and behold, we identify Moshe's grandson as being not just an idolater, but an idolatrous priest, like his great-grandfather, Yitro, who also was a priest. I won't delve too deeply into this. It's an unbelievable story, and there's been a lot written about it. I like to say sometimes, and this is my own idea, the Ashrei has every letter of the alphabet except the Nun. What happened to the Nun? Sometimes I think that what happened to that Nun, it floated over to this verse, to this pasuk in Shoftim, in order to help Moshe and hide the identity of Moshe converting the name into Menashe. In any case, this was Yitro's approach. He would essentially try all of the different religions until he came to what he thought was best. After he sees or hears that Egypt and Amalek are vanquished, he says, I like this brand the best. The others are what we call in Israel Sugbet, brand X. It's interesting to note that Moshe says when he talks to Yitro, 5 times in 5 psukim, he talks about the fact that if Yitro comes, it will be good for him. Let me read you that pasuk. Oh, now I have to find it. Hang on. Because it's one of those things, again, where we are repeating over and over again something that you just have to pick up on. So he says to him, L'chai tanu ve'tavnu lach. Come with us, it will be good for you. Kashem diber tov al Yisrael. because God has spoken good about Israel. And if you come with us, he says, V'haya hatov hahu asher yetiv Hashem imanu v'hitavnu lach. 3 times in the same pasuk, the word good, 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 good. And then even here in our Sedra, again that word comes up. And he says to him, and Yitro says, Vayichad Yitro al kol tova asher asa Hashem Yisrael. He is just overjoyed at all the good that has been done for the Jewish people. No mention of the other side of the coin, of the hardships of being a Jew, of the wars that we have to go through, of the pogroms, of the Holocaust, of the evictions, of the wanderings in history. No. Only thing that's being mentioned here is the good. Yitro rejoiced at all the good. He even got goosebumps. They translate Vayichad. This is going to be good, he says to himself. The problem with that approach and recognizing the good, and there is, of course, tremendous good, that when you decide this is the best religion I found till now, when you find something that looks or tastes or feels better, then you'll drop the Torah and you'll move over to that new religion. And that's the problem with Yitro's conviction and conversion. It is one based on his deciding, this is a great religion. I got to jump on the bandwagon. It is just so good. They beat Egypt. They beat Amalek. Their miracles are being done for them left and right. I've got to join the party. But as we all know, it's not all peaches and cream and a rose garden. Now let's contrast Yitro with the other famous convert in Jewish history, Ruth. And of course, as you see immediately, they share the same letters, except for one, right? Except for the Yud, which was added. But otherwise, Ruth and Yitro have these same letters in their name. That can't be a coincidence. But unlike Yitro, Ruth is different. She doesn't embrace a Judaism that's all about just wealth or pleasure or miracles or victories or success. She signs on to Judaism dafka when it's rough and tough, when she has to beg to even avoid starving to death. Ruth is implored by Naomi to run away, to go away, to distance herself from the Jewish nation. Go back to where you came from, says Naomi, with all good intent. But she stays put. She refuses to leave and return to her pampered palace, like Orpah, right? Her sister-in-law, who the word Orpah means to turn the neck. She turned her neck, like stiff neck. She turned her neck away. And although remember that Ruth was from a privileged family, she doesn't go back there. She accepts the Torah whole, with everything in it. That's why the letters of her name add up to, in Gematria, 611. She embraces Eretz Yisrael. And, the 611, right, the idea that, that 2 of the commandments were given by God directly, and 611 given by Moshe Rabbeinu, and she accepts all of that with everything that it entails. And her life isn't easy. She sees Judaism in its full spectrum. And the result is that she, because of that commitment and that conviction and that devotion, she has a privileged place in Jewish life. She never leaves. We know what happens to her. She gives rise to David HaMelech. She will be the ancestress of Moshiach, and she can claim literally thousands, maybe millions of people named after her, named Ruth, right? My mother's Zichrono Livracha's middle name, and so many other Ruths, because she knew when not to run. Unlike Yitro, who fades into oblivion in Chutz La'aretz, we never hear from him again. He disappears down the sinkhole of history. And no boys that we know of are named Yitro, that I know of. There might be one or two out there somewhere. And we know Jethro from the Beverly Hillbillies, but he doesn't count. No more Yitros. Unlike, of course, Ruth, which is such a beautiful name. I suggest now that this is the reason why Rashi left out the third thing that we would have expected Yitro to hear, Matan Torah. It's Rashi's subtle comment that Yitro's commitment falls short of 100%. Yes, he heard about and was impressed by Egypt's downfall and defeat. Yes, he was absolutely stunned by the schmettering of Amalek. But when it comes to Matan Torah, there's a lot of strings attached to that. It's not all just good in the sense of live it up and enjoy life every minute. He loves the success, the struggle, not so much. But his name is Dafka here in this Sedra to emphasize that to be a Jew, you have to commit to the entire Torah, as Ruth did. Not just the good parts, the easy parts. You have to accept the punishments and the perks. You have to fast as well as you feast. In the battle between the Yitros and the Ruths, I would always root for Ruth. She is really the true model of the righteous convert, of the Ger Tzedek. And that is why we dafka read her story on the day that celebrates Matan Torah on Shavuot. That's fit for her. And Yitro will have his name associated here for eternity because, after all, he is Moshe's father-in-law, I've heard. And, Yitro took him in. By the way, the whole story of Yitro advising him on how to set up courts, different levels of courts, etc. Most of the commentators say this was no chidush for Moshe. This was nothing he didn't know, but he just kind of let his father-in-law say it and give him that honor because that's the kind of humble person Moshe was. So he gets a Sedra. Ruth gets a whole book. She gets a whole Megillah. And it seems to me that she really is the gold standard and represents exactly what we hope someone converting to Judaism will take upon themselves. Judaism in its entirety. And we try to warn them and tell them, it's not all latkes on Hanukkah and huge meals every Friday night. And there's lots of good things. But, let's remember, of course, that it's a full experience. And yes, I'm thankful to the note there that I'm sorry. Roots, of course, is 606. 606, is that right? Thank you. She was already doing the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. Sorry, thank you for that. Thank you for that correction there. But from Alan and Rochelle, yes, and Miriam Dieter, etc., because she already was doing Sheva Mitzvot, so she only would add the 606. But the point is, of course, the same. She accepted Judaism in its entirety. And that's what really made her so special. And that's why it's only appropriate that she becomes the ancestress of Moshiach, because he is going to come and ultimately bring a world of peace and solve the problems. And perhaps it will be a Judaism that really is always good, as Yitro tried to emphasize. We know it's good. Of course it's good. It's wonderful. It's great, but it has its challenges. And therefore, I suggest that Ruth is the one who proves that she's able to overcome all the impediments, tackle all the challenges, climb the highest mountain until ultimately we're going to, on that mountain of Har Moriah, build that third and final Beit HaMikdash with her descendant of Moshiach ben David, Bimherav Yameinu. Amen. So I'm going to stop. Oh, thank you for pointing out Jethro Tull. I don't think he was Jewish either, but if you can get him to convert, I'll think differently. So I'll pause if anybody wants to unmute and wants to make a comment or ask a question. Thank you for the people who put in the chat and pointed out that about the gematria of her name. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
Stuart.
Shari, what would you like to say? Let's
want
Shari say, yes.
Thank you very, very much. I loved the shiur. It was beautiful. The thing that I noticed was I was a bit perturbed when Yitro comes with the family. He doesn't greet his wife. We never hear him say hello to his wife. Nothing. Takes no notice of her. I don't like that.
Very good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I hear.
Can't hear you, Rabbi.
He's muted. He's muted.
Lost you.
Right, muted.
Oh, that's interesting.
Sorry, I got muted there. Who are you talking about, Shari?
606.
Moshe Rabbeinu greets his wife Zipporah. She's not mentioned at all.
Well, Yitro brings her back because she is with Yitro. She and the children.
So he greets Yisrael and he says hello to him and he runs to him and all the rest of it, but we don't hear anything about him greeting his wife. Nothing, not a word.
Oh, you mean about Moshe greeting his wife? Ah,
yes,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah, well, again, that is the subject of a lot of discussion. Indeed, that may be part and parcel of what happens later on with Miriam and Aaron commenting on Moshe's relationship with Tzipporah, and maybe the lack of intimacy there, the lack of connection. But yeah, that's a very good point. And indeed, that may have been what motivated them to say what they said, although they were punished for it. But they obviously saw something there that they considered to be less than exemplary. Yeah. Okay, thank you for that, Shari. Anyone else? You have to unmute yourself, otherwise I can't hear you.
Good.
So,
Wait, I have a question.
David Barrett, hold on. David Barrett, go ahead.
We're accustomed to view the point that Yitro was one of Pharaoh's advisors, okay, with several names. But surely, if that was so, Moshe would have recognized him as one of the advisors, or vice versa, maybe. And there's no comment about that.
Could be. Could be. I don't know. We're not given all the facts about most of these stories in the Torah, so we can't say for certain. And maybe he did. Maybe that's why he went there, recognizing that Yitro had done a good thing by running away, which showed that he didn't want any part of Paro's evil plan. So maybe that's why he went there in the first place. Donna?
Yeah. So, you mentioned that you don't know any Jewish boys named Yitro. And I agree with you thinking about it. I don't know any Jewish boys named Yitro either. But Jethro is actually a pretty common name, like among American Christians, especially Blacks. It was a common name among the slaves also that they gave to their kids. Why do you think that is?
Well, because there were many Americans that just used all the biblical names. And
not thinking about who they were or what they represented.
No, not necessarily. No. And listen, as I said, on the surface, it appears that he's a very exemplary person, and therefore they would have chosen that name. So, but I think we're trying to look a little bit deeper into the issue than just on the surface. Yes.
There's also people named Delilah.
Yeah,
you're right.
Again,
you're right.
I have a whole shiur that I'm not going to give now about the names people choose and we generally get it right, but not always. There's a famous story, which actually my friend Dr. Steve Jackson, the famous Moel here in Renana, told me, that a story about the late Rabbi Eliashiv Zatzal, that he was at the brit of a family relative, not someone who was observant. See, we have this in every family. And of course, they asked him if he would do the naming. And when it came time for the naming, so the father whispered in his ear, Nimrod. And he yelled out, Vikari Shmo B'Yisrael, Chaim Moshe. And the father said, what are you doing? I didn't say that. And he goes, no relative of mine will be named Nimrod if I can help it. And people, again, may choose these names without carefully scrutinizing, maybe by their name or maybe by misconception. Thank God we're not finding Vashti out there. We're not finding Haman and, Bilam and things like that. Let's hope. But yeah, there are some controversial names, and, obviously one should think very, very carefully. And that's why we have a statement by the rabbis that if somebody does, for whatever reason, choose a name that really is inappropriate, although we generally don't change names because names are given with a certain amount of Ruach HaKodesh. But when you choose something that really, truly, is very negative, that is problematic and you can change. And again, I see Edna's writing, there's some other names. Hagar, we don't find really people named Hagar very often, but Hagar has certain very positive characteristics. That's, perhaps why Abraham married her twice. So, there are people who, it's a mixed bag. So, but it's a very fascinating study of the names that people give. So I hope I've given you some, there are Hagars, and that's okay. I always wonder why we have Bilhah and not Zilpah. And there's all kinds of questions, and explanations, but it's hard to, but generally speaking, we vote with our feet, so to speak. What the nation does is usually a good indication of what's right and wrong, but not always. And therefore, if somebody does choose a name that really is inappropriate, those are, exceptions where we might actually change that name. So I hope I've given you some food for thought, and wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. We shall be back, I think, still same time, same place next week. At some point, we're always coordinating with Mincha, so watch the announcements about the times. But as far as I know, next week we'll be back at the same time, 6:15 Israel, 11:15 New York, 9:15 Los Angeles, 4:15 London, and on and on and on. And I see the question here, but I'll have to do it offline. I don't want to keep you. And very good seeing all of you, especially people coming in from near and far. Thank you very much for being with us. Shabbat Shalom U'Barach.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom. Thank you very much.
Shabbat
Thank
Shalom.
you.